Christopher Grant for the prosecution. May I proceed?
Yes, you may.
Thank you. Good morning, Detective Keenan.
Good morning, Mr. Grant.
Please introduce yourself and spell your last name for the record.
Sure, I'm undercover, so I won't be using my real name, but for today, I'm Mickey Keenan, and that's Keenan.
Detective Keenan, what do you do for a living?
Well, I'm a detective at the Special Investigations Division of the Midland State Police Department. Most of the cases that I go undercover for, most of the cases that I work require me to go undercover.
What training have you been through that allows you to be an undercover detective on the Special Investigations Division?
Well, in order to work undercover, all of our training has to be very extensive. My head was filled with everything about proper documentation procedures, proper use of the read technique, how to handle OIAs, and how to avoid inducing criminal activity.
Detective, you just mentioned two terms the jury might be unfamiliar with. Those terms were the read technique and OIAs. I'd like you to please explain those terms.
Certainly.
Let's start with the read technique. What exactly is that?
The read technique is just a simple questioning technique that we use to assess somebody's credibility.
How do you use it?
Well, the interrogator or investigator begins by asking the suspect non-accusatory questions so that the suspect feels comfortable in freely acknowledging and admitting the truth, which, more often than not, is their involvement in criminal activity.
Please explain to the jury what OIAs are as well.
An OIA is an otherwise illegal activity. Now, what these are is so long as you receive written authorization from your supervisor, you can do things that would be considered otherwise illegal, so long as they further your investigation without inducing criminal activity.
Detective, is there documentation of your training as an undercover detective?
Yes, sir.
Would you be able to provide that documentation here in court today?
Unfortunately not. I'm part of a sensitive undercover investigation right now, and all of my documentation is classified, unavailable for the view of people outside the department.
Detective, throughout your career, how many undercover investigations have you been a part of?
Well, most undercover operations involve a large amount of time in them. But I've been involved in a handful of cases.
And what types of cases have you worked in the past?
Primarily, I deal with white-collar crime.
Detective, I'd like to move on to talking about today's case. Please tell the jury what your involvement in today's case is.
Certainly. My involvement began in July of 2013 when I was placed undercover at the Midlands Gambling Commission, and it ended in April of 2015 at the investigation's conclusion.
What led you to go undercover at the Midlands Gambling Commission?
The department had been receiving tips about possible corruption coming from within the commission, so I was placed undercover on Chase Covington's staff to determine whether or not those tips held any validity.
Did any of those tips hold any validity?
Yes, we found direct evidence of corruption.
Did any of that evidence of corruption that you found tie back to the defendant in today's case?
Yes, the corruption that we found directly tied the defendant to the commission.
Detective Keenan, do you see Avery Bancroft in trial today?
Yes, she's sitting at the end of the table in the blue shirt.
Your Honor, may the record reflect that the witness has properly identified Avery Bancroft as the defendant.
It will.
Detective Keenan, please tell the jury how you began your investigation.
Yeah, so I began my investigation by going undercover as an auditor on Chase Covington's staff. And it was during my time undercover that the commission announced that they would be accepting proposals for a new casino license they'd be voting on in April.
How was Mr. Covington involved with the Midlands Gambling Commission?
Chase Covington was actually the chair of the Midlands Gambling Commission.
Now, when your department placed you undercover at the Midlands Gambling Commission, did the defendant have any relevant role in your department's decision to do so?
No. At the time that I was placed undercover, I was simply placed to investigate the commission by itself. At that point, Avery Bancroft wasn't a person of interest in our investigation.
And why did you begin investigating Ms. Bancroft?
Well, Avery Bancroft became a person of interest in February of 2015. I was in Chase's office when I overheard a phone call on speakerphone between Chase and Miss Bancroft.
What was said during that phone call?
Well, it was on speakerphone, so I was able to hear both sides. Miss Bancroft opened up with, "Hey, I heard about the new casino. I'm putting together a proposal, and I just wanted to talk about it. To, grease the wheels."
And how did Mr. Covington respond to Ms. Bancroft's statements?
Mr. Covington's tone became very harsh, and he seemed a little bit nervous at that. He said, "I'm going to have to talk to you later. I'm in here with a staffer."
Objection, Your Honor, hearsay, Chase Covington's statements.
Response?
Your Honor, these statements fall under an exception to the hearsay rule, under Rule 801 D2E. These statements were made by the opposing party's co-conspirator in furtherance of a conspiracy.
May I respond?
Yes.
Your Honor, at this point in the trial, there's been no testimony laid, no foundation to establish that a conspiracy is actually taking place. Now, this statement here does not show very much information regarding any sort of conspiracy that may exist. Therefore, this statement does not further this conspiracy, this alleged conspiracy, and is therefore not admissible through 801 D2E.
Any response?
Your Honor, it's already been established that Ms. Bancroft bribed Mr. Covington. It's already been established that there was a conspiracy between Ms. Bancroft and Mr. Covington. Now, this phone call that this witness just testified to was the beginning of that conspiracy.
May I respond once more, Your Honor?
Yes.
Your Honor, regarding the specific statements that were elicited, the statements do not directly further this conspiracy. I understand that Ms. Bancroft has already admitted to offering the bribe, and that there is a conspiracy. However, the statements must further the conspiracy. Any statements by Chase Covington aren't necessarily admissible unless they further this conspiracy.
So you're conceding that there was a conspiracy?
No, Your Honor. I'm conceding that that opposing counsel is correct that Ms. Bancroft has admitted to a bribe. However, if there's established conspiracy, these statements need to be furthering this alleged conspiracy.
May I respond?
Okay, that's all right. I distinctly heard you say there was in fact a conspiracy, so you sunk your own boat. So, overruled.
Detective Keenan, what did Mr. Covington say in response to Ms. Bancroft's statements?
Well, Chase's voice got a little nervous sounding, and he was fidgeting in his chair a little bit. He said, "I'm in here with a staffer right now. I'm going to have to talk to you later," and ended the call immediately.
As an undercover detective, what was your reaction to hearing this phone call?
Well, that was a red flag for me as an indication that there was a potential for bribery taking place. So it was at that point that Avery Bancroft became a person of interest in my investigation.
Following this phone call, how did you proceed with your investigation?
I reached out to Avery Bancroft's executive assistant, Corey Hyde. Corey seemed like a great person to bring on my investigation because Corey was able to set up meetings for Ms. Bancroft, and that was how I was able to sit on one between myself, Ms. Bancroft, Mr. Covington, and with Corey Hyde.
When did that meeting take place?
This would have been on April 13th of 2015.
How did the discussion for this meeting begin?
Well, before we even got into the meeting, we were met by the head of security at the Black Bear, and he swept us for all of our electronics. I mean, he took our cell phones, our tablets, everything that we had that was digital, he took from us. And that was before we even got into the meeting.
So, Officer Keenan, what was discussed inside of the meeting?
Well, for a while, the two candidates were for a while, Mr. Covington and Ms. Bancroft were just discussing their proposals, and then Chase started asking questions about money. Ms. Bancroft said, "Of course, it's always about the money with you."
What happened after Ms. Bancroft said that?
Well, that was another red flag for me, so at that point, I picked up a pen and a napkin and slid it across the table to Ms. Bancroft.
What did Ms. Bancroft do with that napkin and pen?
She took the napkin and began writing on it.
Would you recognize a picture of that napkin if I had it here to show to you?
Yes, sir.
Let the record reflect I'm approaching opposing counsel with prosecution's Exhibit 1.
It will.
May I approach the witness?
You may.
Does Your Honor require a courtesy copy?
I'll take one, sure. Thank you.
Detective, what did I just hand you?
This is a photo of the napkin that Ms. Bancroft wrote on during the April 13th meeting.
How do you know it's the same napkin?
I recognize the handwriting on it.
Is it a fair and accurate picture of the napkin Ms. Bancroft wrote on?
Yes, it is.
Your Honor, at this time, the prosecution moves to admit prosecution's 1 into evidence.
Any objections?
None, Your Honor.
Okay, it's admitted.
So after Ms. Bancroft wrote yes equals 150K on the napkin, what did she do with that napkin?
Well, after she wrote the yes equals 150K, she slid it across the table to Mr. Covington.
And what did Mr. Covington do with that napkin?
Chase picked it up, looked at it, and then slid it back across the table to Miss Bancroft.
Now, after Mr. Covington declined Miss Bancroft's napkin, what was Miss Bancroft's reaction?
Well, she picked up the pen again, crossed out the 150K, and then below it wrote $sign 250K. So now the napkin read yes equals $250,000, and she slid it right back across the table to Mr. Covington.
And how did Mr. Covington respond to the napkin with a higher dollar amount?
Upon receiving the napkin a second time, Chase Covington picked it up and put it in his pocket.
Now, after Mr. Covington put that napkin in his pocket, how did the meeting proceed from there?
Well, after that, there was a knock on the door. The bellhop, Devin Del Sesto, had brought up a cheese and wine platter. And after Devin Del Sesto dropped it off and left, Chase got really nervous. He seemed a little concerned that somebody had interrupted what was supposed to be a private meeting.
And how did the defendant respond to Mr. Covington's concern?
Miss Bancroft tried to reassure Chase that everybody at the Black Bear knows how to be discreet, but Chase wasn't having any of it and left the meeting immediately.
Did you ever meet with Miss Bancroft and Mr. Covington again before the vote?
The four of us were supposed to meet one more time before the vote. That was on April 16th, but Chase Covington never showed to that one.
Detective, are you aware of what this trial here today is about?
Yes, the defendant admits to bribing Chase Covington to secure a vote for her casino proposal. However, she's saying that I've forced her to do it.
What is your response to that?
I would never do that. That'd be endangering not only my career, but an investigation that the department had been working on for 2 years.
Detective, have you ever threatened Miss Bancroft?
No,
Have you ever threatened her business?
no,
And were you present at the time that she bribed Mr. Covington?
no, I wasn't.
Thank you, Detective Keenan. I have no further questions for this witness.
All right.
May I assume that the evidence is already published to the jury?
Sure.
Thank you.
May I proceed?
Yes.
Officer Kimball, or Officer Keenan, you were involved with the Midlands Gambling Commission starting about 1.5 years before the bribe, isn't that true?
Yes,
And you just said on direct examination that over the 2-year period of time where they were under investigation, Avery Bancroft and Chase Covington were under investigation that whole time.
no, Chase Covington, or the Midlands Gambling Commission was under investigation the entire time. Avery Bancroft wasn't involved until February.
But didn't you just say on direct examination that this alleged conspiracy was investigated for over 2 years?
No, the investigation lasted 2 years. The conspiracy was for the latter part of the investigation.
So let's talk a little bit more about the actual investigation itself. You mentioned on direct examination that you relied on these OIAs, isn't that true?
Partially, yes.
And it's standing for otherwise illegal activity.
Yes.
Would you say this is part of your job to operate under these undercover?
Sometimes it can be, yes.
But it's your testimony that you relied on these for your investigation.
When it's necessary, yes.
So you think it's relevant to talk about these OIAs in this case?
Yes.
Do you remember writing an affidavit for this case?
Yes.
So you'd recognize it if I showed it to you?
Yes.
Your Honor, Commissioner approach opposing counsel with the witness's affidavit.
You may.
Commissioner approach the witness.
You may.
Officer Keenan, I've just handed you the affidavit you wrote for this case, didn't I?
Yes.
And just taking a look at it right now, it looks to be the same one that you wrote.
Yes.
Now, if I can turn your attention to the last page in this affidavit. That is your signature,
Yes, it is.
and you testify that all relevant information was supposed to be included in this affidavit,
Yes.
especially all relevant information that you actually can talk about.
Yes.
Officer Keenan, can you point out in this affidavit where you mention these relevant OIAs?
Certainly. There is the point where I blackmailed Corey Hyde into partaking in my investigation.
Excuse me, officer, let me re-ask my question and rephrase it. Where do you specifically mention otherwise illegal activity as part of your investigation?
As in the words, otherwise illegal activity specifically?
Yes, part of the training that you received about otherwise illegal activity.
It is not in here. I did mention that I went to the Midlands Police Academy though.
Thank you, Officer Keenan. Commissioner, approach the witness to retrieve the evidence, retrieve the document.
You may.
Now, Officer Keenan, I'd like to talk to you a little about your initial beginnings of the investigation with your boss, Detective Kimball.
Okay.
Now, in learning about this case, now, Detective Kimball, excuse me, had a plan for you guys, didn't he?
I'm sorry?
He had a plan and a mission of the department.
Yes.
And he actually explained this in an email, didn't he?
Yes, he did.
You recognize that email if I showed it to you?
Yes, I would.
Commissioner, approach opposing counsel with what has been marked as defendants 1.
You may.
A, excuse me. Commissioner, approach the witness.
You may.
Thank you.
Would Your Honor like a courtesy copy?
Yes, please. Thank you.
Now, Officer Keenan, I've just handed you the email you received from your boss, Detective Kimball,
Yes.
and that's the same email you remember receiving.
Yes, it is.
And that's a fair and accurate copy of the email that you saw.
Yes, it appears to all be here.
And just a general idea that this email talked about the mission and the plan of your department.
Yes.
Your Honor, at this time, I move to admit defendants A into evidence.
All right, any objections?
Yes, Your Honor, objection to hearsay.
All right,
Fair
response?
response.
Yes.
Yes, Your Honor. Under Rule 803.3, though this document is a hearsay statement, it's an exception to hearsay under 803.3, the mental state and condition of the declarant. Now, the declarant, Detective Kimball, as the witness identified, was explaining the mission and the plan of the department. He's specifically describing his state of mind at the time while writing the email, describing the state of mind and the plan of the department and the plan of Detective Kimball, and therefore the statement falls under Rule 803.3.
All right, any response to that?
Your Honor, this statement does not fall under the exception to hearsay under Rule 803.3. Rule 803.3 needs to explain motive, plan, or intent. In this case, this is just an email that was sent to the entire department as they had a new police chief. He was introducing himself to the department.
May I respond?
Sure.
Your Honor, opposing counsel is entirely correct in saying that it needs to talk about a plan. This is exactly what this email is. It's Detective Kimball explaining his plan for the department, explaining his intent of the department and the mission, and he's accurately just reflecting this in the document. Therefore, it falls under 803.3.
I'll give you one more response.
Your Honor, this document does not show a plan at all. Now, the only thing that this email shows us is that Detective Kimball was introducing himself through an email to the entire department, and that he was going to go through the entire department and personally give speeches and show that, just introduce himself to the department as the new police chief.
Your Honor, may I make an offer of proof?
Sure.
The exact plan that's outlined in this document is talking about the 3 missions of the department. And those missions specifically describe what Detective Kimball wants of his employees, especially including Officer Keenan. He's describing the plan in specific steps.
Your Honor, if I may respond one final time.
Yes, that's fine. With the offer of proof, I will certainly let you respond. Go ahead.
Your Honor, this email does not show a plan. It specifically just shows the values of the new police chief in coming into the department and what he wants to see in his officers.
That was intriguing too. All right. What's your response to the notion that these are more values than plans?
Your Honor, may I continue off the offer of proof?
Sure.
The specific plan that I'm talking about are those 3 steps. Now, as the witness will testify if this is let in, is that these 3 steps specifically outline what Detective Kimball wants the Officer Keenan and other officers to do. Now, this is, of course, explaining a value of what Detective Kimball values of his department. However, it's specifically describing a plan on how his officers will support those values, as opposed to merely just explaining the values. He's explaining a plan to support the values. Therefore, it still falls under 803.3.
All right. I somewhat agree with both of you, but given that it's just a preponderance standard here, that this needs to show a plan, I will err on the side of that, so I will leg again under that exception, so overruled.
Yes, Your Honor.
Now, Officer Keenan, in reference to this email, Detective Kimball explains 3 steps to you, isn't that true?
Yes.
Could you read the first step for us?
In its entirety or just the title?
Just the title of it.
Crackdown on corruption.
And the title of the second one?
Be newsworthy.
And the title of the third?
Do whatever it takes without breaking the law.
All right, so let's talk about the first one, corruption. Now, your job, according to this email, was to focus on corruption, right?
Well, yes, corruption is a very big problem within the state of Midlands. That's just something that can't happen.
But Officer Keenan, your experiences with undercover other undercover cases isn't with corruption, is it?
It's with white-collar crime usually, yes.
But with drug stings mainly, right?
Sometimes, yes.
So let's talk about the third one under then. Could you read that statement one more time?
Yes, do whatever it takes. These criminals are smart
Thank you,
and
Officer
we
Keenan.
need to stay ahead of them.
Officer Keenan, thank you. Now, in that statement, do whatever it takes. Did you take that literally?
Yes, he says do whatever it takes without breaking the law, and that's exactly what I did.
Officer Keenan, just to talk about this a little bit more, doing whatever it takes. Officer Kimball in this talks about catching the big fish, right?
Yes, corrupt officials.
Catching the big fish means that you had to do whatever it took to catch the big fish, right?
Again, outside of breaking the law, yes.
You permission to approach the witness or retrieve the evidence?
Yes, you may.
And would Your Honor like the identified copy?
No, thanks, we'll just keep the other one.
Now, Officer Keenan, you also wrote an email to Corey Hyde, didn't you?
Yes, I did.
As Corey Hyde was your informant?
Yes.
And you recognize that email if I showed it to you today?
Yeah.
Permission to approach opposing counsel with what is marked as defense speed?
Yes, you may.
Permission to approach the witness?
You may.
And would Your Honor like a courtesy copy?
Sure.
Thank you.
Now, Officer Keenan, this is the email that I was just mentioning that you sent to Corey Hyde.
Yes.
Now that email, you recognize that email as the exact email you sent.
Yes, as well as Corey Hyde's response.
And this is a fair and accurate copy.
Yes.
And just as a general idea, in this email, you outlined your instructions to Corey Hyde, didn't you?
I outlined a couple steps that he could take, yes.
Your Honor, at this time I move to admit defenses B into evidence.
Any objections?
Yes, Your Honor, objection to hearsay.
All right, response.
Your Honor, this document, though it is hearsay, it also falls under Rule 8033. Now, it's similar to the last. Now, this is describing the instructions, the plan of Officer Keenan. Now, Officer Keenan's explaining that he exactly wants Corey Hyde to do these steps, and that's the plan. And it's similar to the situation with Detective Kimball. Now, in this, Officer Keenan, in explaining these instructions, he's explaining his state of mind about his plan and his intent of the investigation. And therefore, this falls under 8033.
Any response to that?
Your Honor, this email doesn't fall under Rule 8033 because it doesn't show a plan, motive, or intent. The only thing this email does is it's Officer Keenan just making sure that his informant is ready to wear a wire for the meeting tomorrow. That's the only thing that this email shows.
May I respond?
Yes.
Your Honor, in doing so, Officer Keenan is explaining the plan. And that's how he prepared Corey Hyde for the meeting the following day. He's describing his plan, describing his intent of the investigation, and his intent in what he wanted of Corey Hyde. He's exactly describing what that mindset is, and therefore it does fall under 8033.
We'll give you the final word.
Your Honor, once again, this does not fall under Rule 8033. It doesn't show plan, motive, or intent, and that's what it needs to show, fall under Rule 8033. This email is simply Officer Keenan checking up with Corey Hyde to make sure that Corey Hyde is ready to go into the meeting and wear a wire. This email doesn't show plan, motive, or intent.
All right, I'll sustain that objection.
Thank you,
First,
Your
to approach the witness. Retrieve
Yes.
evidence.
Would you like your courtesy copy as well?
Yes, Your Honor. Now, I'd like to talk about that napkin you mentioned on direct examination.
Okay.
That napkin exchange occurred on April 13th, correct?
Yes.
Now, just to begin, Avery Bancroft didn't ask for the napkin, did she?
No.
You willingly slid it over to her.
Yes, after she said that it was always about the money, yes.
But Officer Keenan, let's get something right here. Avery Bancroft initially refused to write anything on the napkin.
I'm sorry?
She slid it back to you, didn't she?
She wiped her face with it.
And then slid it back to you?
Yes.
But then you slid it back to her once more and you whispered, "It's all about the money."
Yeah, I repeated her own words. It's always about the money.
And it was at that point, after you slid the napkin to her a second time, that Avery Bancroft actually wrote on the napkin.
Yes.
Thank you, I have nothing further.
Sorry, I need to redirect.
No redirect, Your Honor. I just asked that the witness be excused.
You may, thank you. Is the prosecution ready for their next witness?
Yes, Your Honor, at this time we call Dr. Lisa Rose.
All right,
Permission to set up a demonstrative exhibit in the well before beginning.
sure.